Signal is a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm your host and the Beacon's editor-in-chief, Cyril McGlego. Twice a month, we'll use this space to shine a light on the right-wing extremist currents streaming through Bucks County and beyond. We'll talk to guests who will help listeners navigate these perilous political waters by providing insight, analysis, and organizing solutions so that we can steer the community toward calmer, saner, progressive routes. Barbara Simmons served as executive director for 30 years of the Peace Center, an educational peace and justice nonprofit organization in Bucks County. She was founding director of PeaceTalks Radio, producing radio documentaries from across the globe, which aired on NPR, PRI, and many other stations. She also serves on the board of the Nakashima Foundation for Peace. Today I talked to Barbara about why she memorializes the barbaric bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and her life as a longtime peace activist. Hi Barbara, welcome to The Signal.
Thanks, Cyril. I'm glad to be here.
Barbara, you organized an event Monday at Pennswood Village in Newtown to commemorate America's use of weapons of mass destruction in Japan when President Truman ordered the War Department, now known as the Department of Defense, to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima August 6, 1945, and then 3 days later, another one on the city of Nagasaki. As a result, the cities were instantaneously reduced to rubble, and in a flash, tens of thousands of innocent civilians incinerated, with a steady stream of thousands more dying in the days that followed due to the lingering effects of their burns and radiation poisoning, exacerbated with the wiped out infrastructure. Can you tell us about the event that you organized and why you believe it's important to memorialize these dark days?
For many, well, at least for 35 years, this has been an important and somber event for me. When I first learned of BAND, which was Bucks Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament, and I became a volunteer, it was because I was worried about my kids having to grow up in a world just with way too many nuclear weapons. We needed no nuclear weapons at all, as far as I was concerned. But I was particularly moved with the event down in Bristol Borough on the wharf, and we were putting the flotillas onto the water, and these flotillas represented people who had been burned from this atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who went to the water because it was their first instinct was to go to the water because their body was on fire. So the Peace Center at the time, band of the Peace Center, created these flotillas as one portion of this commemoration. And so these candles would be lit and would be all along the Delaware River at the Bristol Wharf. We would always have a hibakusha come and speak, and a hibakusha is a victim of the atomic bombing. We would have music, and growing up in this traditional school system that we have in our country, you hear history from the victor, and you don't hear the history of those who on the other side who lost their lives. So this event was like, it opened up my eyes to this horror. And my father fought in World War II. He was shot down by a Japanese fighter plane, very badly injured, spent months in the hospital. And so I really saw this as an opportunity to understand more about how do we let others know about the history of this event. So these commemorations became very important to me. Today's event, or the Monday's event at Pennswood Village, is just that continuation of some kind of annual commemoration. About 2001, we were given a peace pole by the hibakusha who came here from Japan, and the next year we were given another peace pole that we gave then to Pennswood Village. And Pennswood Village is a retirement community in Bucks County, and so that Peace Pole commemoration from, their very early 2000s was an important way to, if you can't be at the river, what else is possible? So we have this commemoration around the Peace Pole, if it's possible to be outside. Today, because of the threat of rain, we held the event indoors. And so the event was, where we have music, we have, peace music, we show photos of that Joe O'Donnell, who was a 23-year-old Marine who had been put into Hiroshima just a couple days after the bombing. He was a combat photographer. The photos that he took, and he was sending them back, back home to where he was supposed to be sending them, but he quickly realized that they were not being shown to the public. And so he started to do something more subversive, which was to develop the film in his helmet and send the film to his mother's home. And he never looked at that film again for 50 years. And he really regretted not bringing that to light sooner. But he was just so traumatized by what he saw. He just couldn't believe what he was seeing. And so that trauma just lived within him. And, he went on to be the photographer for the White House for 5 administrations. He spoke of his regret. He believed the bombing was as morally wrong as the Holocaust. And it's the threat of nuclear war that's still with us today that really prompted him to continue to, what he did is he put together a book, and the book is titled Japan 1945, a U.S. Marine's Photographs from Ground Zero. Joe O'Donnell is no longer with us, but I had the opportunity to interview him. He himself had to undergo 40 surgeries because he was exposed to the radiation.
Wow.
So I met with about 50 families, 50 habaksha, and some of them had their families with them. They had been children at the time. So today's event was to share one of those stories, to share Joe O'Donnell's work. Steve Nolan read a poem about the Hiroshima bombing.
Barbara, when did you travel to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to interview these survivors?
I wanted to put together an audio documentary about it that was going to be airing on NPR. It was 60 years later. We're now 78 years out, so it was it was about 18 years ago. 15, 16, 17, 18 years ago. But it still really sits with me, to see how the city has been rebuilt, to go to the museum. One of the things you can't really capture anymore are these stories from the victims themselves, because most of them are no longer alive. And even telling one of the stories today, I had to really eliminate a lot of it because it would have made people ill. It's so horrendous. Part of my grief over all of this is that if the world had seen how horrific this was within days of this happening 78 years ago, I can't help but believe we would have turned against nuclear weapons. This has been an important commemoration, but again, the narrative that's been created is that we had no choice but to drop these bombs, that it's what ended the war, that it's what, saved American lives. And I question that narrative. And every time I question that narrative, it is controversial because people's parents fought in that war, or if I have anyone who, still in their 90s still may be around, or their spouses. They just have a hard time hearing that it was not necessary to drop this bomb.
I can't even imagine, given the environment that we live in today, a teacher kind of bringing up that perspective in the classroom without facing a fierce and just rabid backlash by even questioning, the morality of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Barbara, I want to just kind of like step back again and talk a little bit about BAND, which you mentioned, which was the Bucks Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament. And this was a group that formed in the early 80s. I believe it was 1982. It was started by a local couple, and at least they were part of the group that started it, Barbara and Paul Zimmerman.
Well, actually, it was several people that started it. Nan and Bill Strong were another couple, along with Joanne and Lou Woodman, Bob and Helen Lovett, Betsy and Bob Applebaum, Jennifer and Tony Wolf. I mean, this really was an effort that took a village to start. Paul Zimmerman was probably the most vocal. He was their first president. He he was someone who was a screenwriter in Hollywood, so he had a lot of charisma, and he held an event here in Newtown, Bucks County, where I live, just up the street at the Newtown Theater. He held a red carpet event for his movie, The King of Comedy, and that was the first benefit for the Bucks Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament.
And that was directed by Martin Scorsese
Yeah,
and starred Robert De Niro and Jerry Lewis.
right.
Huge movie.
Yeah,
And the proceeds of that, they used that as seed money
right.
to start BAND, which would
Correct.
become the Peace Center eventually.
Yeah, and that's why Paul's name is always associated with it. But I always want to make sure I mention there's probably at least 15 people that were part of that effort.
And so, what was it like? You were a young activist at the time. How did you get involved with BAND?
I was a parent of a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, two daughters, and I grew up at a time when duck and cover was the norm. And anybody that knows anything about nuclear weapons, the duck and cover thing is just such a joke. It's just insane to think that somehow going under a desk was going to save us from nuclear war. But as a parent, I I cared about the environment. I cared about what was happening with what are we learning in school? What are our kids being taught about history? And it just seemed to me that it was lacking in real world kinds of issues. So I just had a lot of concerns about world peace. And so I went to one of their meetings, and it was at a local school. And I continued to go to meetings. I continued to meet really unique people who were all part of this movement. And I started volunteering my time. And the next thing I know, the executive director was leaving, and I had become the assistant to the executive director, and I took over as executive director. I felt like if I'm not part of the solution, I'm part of the problem. And so I was working with people like Paul and Bab Zimmerman. They very much all these people became my mentors. And what I was learning from them is that the amount of money that we were spending on weaponry was completely out of balance with money that was being spent for things like housing and healthcare and education. And so, when I looked at the numbers, which are incredible, I was just at the UN the other day, and the numbers, the amount of world spending on military, it dwarfs everything else that any kind of human needs.
I mean, the US government was spending, I believe it was at least $2 billion developing the bombs, and that was back in the 1940s,
Right,
right?
right,
And then just that's just one little sliver of the military budget, and that's just exponentially grown in
right.
the decades that followed.
Yeah, and all we end up with is a more dangerous world because then everyone else feels the need to have nuclear weapons. So yeah, so these having an organization like the Bucks Alliance for Nuclear Disarmament at the Peace Center, even albeit it was a small group, people like Dr. Helen Caldicott, for example, who was writing books about this. She was a pediatrician living in New Zealand that was seeing the after effects of the atomic bombing testing in the Bikini Islands. More and more people were understanding and wanted to understand, what is the necessity of these bombs? Why are we doing this? Why aren't we spending money on human needs? And that made sense to me. So I very much became part of that effort. The idea that when the Cold War ended, so to speak, and the nuclear weapon arsenal was cut in half, a lot of organizations folded. The Peace Center pivoted its focus to this idea of how do we create a world that no longer wants to go to war. Our work changed because what we were finding was that people didn't feel the urgency of nuclear war anymore. So we started working a lot with schools and helping children deal with, what does it mean to be peaceful? What does it mean to deal with conflicts that can escalate into violence? How do you prevent that or how do you intervene with that? So our work pivoted and we became well known working in about 300 schools in Bucks County. And I still believe that work needs to be done. And I have to say it, my work at Arcadia University's International Peace Program, half of my students were trained as peer mediators when they were in middle school and high school and saw that as a mediator, you really could prevent violent conflict. They've gone on to get their master's degree in international peace. I still very much believe there is that mission has can have great outcomes, but we still are spending far too much money on these weaponries. And I, how do we create a scenario where people are now reminded that we are closer than ever on the doomsday clock? That is by a group of scientists looking at what's happening in the world, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, what's happening in our world, and it's 90 seconds before midnight. So that is something we need to really be doing something about again, but it doesn't seem to be. I mean, I would say in the last probably 10 years, people are bombarded with too many things that have gone wrong in our world, and they're getting saturated with, which direction you go in. Our environment is burning up, you know, so a lot of people are putting their energies in that direction, which is needed. We've got a lot of people putting their energies to fighting the hate that's been happening since 2016. Others are working towards telling the real story of slavery and the indigenous people's stories. So, and then COVID hit. So it's like trying to get people to think about nuclear weapons again and the insanity of it. Having the movie come out about Oppenheimer was a perfect way to try and get people to realize the absolute horror. And so maybe there is the ability to have another or revitalize the movement, the nuclear disarmament movement.
Yes, I mean that's the hope. I mean, it is encouraging that a 3-hour movie about Oppenheimer is doing so well at the theaters. I did want to just mention, you mentioned Helen Caldecott, that she actually came to Bucks County,
Hmm.
in an event for band and spoke at Neshaminy High School, which for me, I just think it's remarkable that you guys were able to bring in someone like that in Bucks. I mean, what you said, the progressive, peace community was small at the time. But what I want to know is just like, how did you build that community? And is there that community now in Bucks County? Or is, like you said, are people just kind of like pulled, 1,000 different ways at once? For example, with what's happening in different school districts, at school board meetings. I think that's like one important kind of like part of like the progressive community in Bucks County, which I've been learning about since I've started writing about Bucks for in the last 3 years. They're doing some extraordinary work, but I'm not seeing so much of a peace or anti-war kind of movement flourishing. And the last thing I'll say about that is like that's just not Bucks County, right? That I think that's just across the nation.
Well, when your democracy is being attacked, where do you put your energies? And what people are finding across the nation, and it just really angers me that the far right has decided to make issues out of non-issues, and therefore it serves as a distraction. And in that distraction, you lose sight of the bigger picture sometimes, right? Like I'm going to all these school board meetings because the extremists are there and they're wreaking havoc, and they've been told to take over the school boards, etc. And so, how much can a person fight holding on to their democracy? I think there's been, a big effort to stop book banning, to run for office, right? We've got members running for school boards that hadn't thought about running for school board members. It's a distraction, but unfortunately it's a necessary thing that we have to do. When we were having programs to bring attention to nuclear disarmament issues, nobody worried about the school board, Cyril. You trusted the people that were running your school board. It also was a very white movement, a white suburban movement, because people of color were dealing with toxic waste in their communities, dealing with all kinds of issues of racism in all levels of our society and our institutions. We missed what might have been happening for people of color because we were looking at this bigger picture of nuclear disarmament. And then the anti-choice movement came into play. So people were having to put energies into making sure reproductive freedom was happening, making sure people could walk from their car to the clinic, for their reproductive rights to be fulfilled. And so the far right has definitely distracted us on many levels. And while they were distracting us on all these different in all these different areas, they were also taking over our Supreme Court. It's like, where do you put your energy? And I think that, in Bucks County, if there is any school, I'll give you an example. 2.5 weeks ago, it'll be 3 weeks on Thursday, we learned that at one of the school districts, a person of color had gone to in front of her school board to, as a citizen and a parent, to say, I really think that we all need to read White Fear. This is a book that can help us understand, why we're so fearful of having a DEI director, etc. And she had wonderful testimony, but was attacked afterwards. And so now the NAACP, and I'm part of that executive committee, we're showing up at these meetings because, and I have to say, there must have been at least 30 people that came in support of this one parent. Even though it's a distraction, when I saw the numbers of people showing up, Cyril, it showed me that we do still care about democracy. It's vacation time. People didn't have to be there, but they showed up in support of this parent. So I think that there's what I see as a lot of activism, but it's activism that is we tend to be a species that looks at what's the most important thing right at this moment, today, tonight, tomorrow morning, and we act on that. If we can, those of us that are activists, if you can ever get a break, it's like, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to worry about nuclear disarmament today, because I'm having to go to a school board meeting. So we are being pulled in a lot of different directions, and I don't see it slowing down anytime soon. But I still think, in spite of having to deal with all these massive issues that we are facing, that are distractions, they're important that we address them so that they're not taken over by the far right. I still think, when I look at the doomsday clock, when I look at what Russia threaten, every time Russia feels threatened, they threaten with nuclear weapons. And look how many nations have nuclear weapons now. And so, I do still feel an enormous responsibility and obligation to call attention to it, to continue to do whatever I can to show people the stories of Hiroshima, because if we can remember, much like the Holocaust, we can still be saying, never again, never again.
Sure. I mean, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is what has kind of like pushed the doomsday clock up. One question that I've kind of like grappled with is, how do you be a peace activist? How do you maintain your kind of like principles of peace while rejecting like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and wanting to kind of like, you know, assist the Ukrainian people and kind of like help them, repel Russian military forces? I mean, I don't mean to stick you with like such a weighty question, but do you have an answer to that? Because I can't, personally, I've been having a hard time kind of like, figuring out a clear position, a position of peace that rejects the Russian invasion. And I think, maybe when it's like the US like invading another country like Iraq, it's a little clear cut.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and easier to say like pull the troops out, right?
Right, right.
But what do you think is the kind of like, the answer to that kind of dilemma?
Yeah, it's a weighty question, and it deserves a really thoughtful answer. When you watch in horror as a place like Russia invades a country like that, my regret is that they're not a part of NATO, that Ukraine is not a part of NATO. But then the answer is, well, if it was a part of NATO, then we would be in World War III. And I'm not so sure about that. I'm constantly talking to different people. My latest conversation was with Dr. Jenny Beer, who she's a mediator, and she went with Japan. She went with me to Japan. She was my translator. She speaks fluent Japanese, very much a peace activist. And her brother is a peace activist and works in DC as brokering peace deals and peace treaties. And we spoke about this on Friday night because I asked her this very question. She said, this is a really tough one. Like, what would happen if we asked Russia to be part of NATO? Would they feel less threatened, for example? Or what would happen if we could, all the Russian soldiers that are now in Ukraine fighting, what if we could give them free passage? You know, we don't usually turn to nonviolence for many of these horrendous wars that are going on around the world, whether it's, Sudan or Haiti or, Rwanda. We want to believe, and I want to believe that the United Nations, the blue helmets could show up and stop what's happening, and creativity should take over. I want answers. I want to know what it is that we can do to support the Ukrainian people and not support war, because, that is not where people always say, well, war is the last option. I can't help but think that there's got to be 99 other options before we fire a bullet. But it takes some of the best minds, like the United States Institute for Peace or the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy. Peacemaking takes a long time. It takes a lot longer than what a bomb could do, what a landmine could do. When these kinds of things are in the making, there's no money for places like the United States Institute for Peace to go in. I think they've got like a budget of $8 million. It can't compete with the budgets for going to war. I don't think our generals ever want war because they've been through war. The type of diplomacy I want to see does take a very long time, because it is about pulling together all aspects of a society to work through the conflict. But then you've got, Putin is a complete fascist. He's not one that's going to be for dialogue, and he wants power. Stalin is his hero. And so we kind of have to, it seems hard for us to sit by and watch all this happen and just sell them, the weapons they need.
Well, I think part of the problem is that, the media doesn't interrogate the possibilities of nonviolent conflict resolution. It doesn't platform nonviolent or peace voices within these discussions, I'd say largely, especially the mainstream media. And even it reluctantly covers, the true carnage of war. And that dates back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when there was heavy government censorship, of course, but a lot of the media outlets kind of like went along with it. And that's something, we've seen in present day as well, when it comes to, what happened in the Iraq war. Never mind the torture that our government, did, and the reporting. And even if you're, looking at like the Bucks County Courier Times, or, even the Philadelphia Inquirer, which I like, and I think it's a useful paper, like you're not seeing anything about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that's something, like you said, that we need to be reminded of this. Like, this is what we are capable of doing because we did it. And if we do it again, that might be the, end of the world as we know it, at the very least.
Well, I want, in talking about the media, I've always been really impressed that the Beacon and the Signal, you do this without very much money. And most media outlets can't operate like that. And so back 20 years ago, we stopped sending reporters out internationally because of the cost. And the cost, any money went toward 24/7 reporting. And so politics is the cheapest thing you can possibly cover. There's so much news that we don't get. That's the one thing I want to say. But the second thing I want to say is that if I even look at my local school, any of the districts I've worked in, there's not a lot of money put towards peace programs, Cyril. Very, very little money. And if they get little money at all, it's from a grant that the Peace Center wrote or that they wrote. And so we've never put emphasis on peacemaking, peace building, understanding how to deal with conflicts. We just don't invest in it in our society and in most places around the world. And so I'm not surprised by what we have. And no matter where I go, if I'm going into a business and they've got a conflict at a business, they might say, well, what's it going to take? Write me a proposal to end this conflict. There might be a need to be with the business for 12 hours. And they say, no, I need you to deal with this conflict in 2 hours. That's all we have time for. And so if we understand that more money must be put into this and it's going to take longer, peace building takes longer in the beginning. But once you've got it established, it automatically helps with those conflicts as they come into being, because we're always surrounded by conflict. It's always going to be there. We just don't have the tools to deal with it. And so I've always seen it as, we have a hammer for the nail, but we have all these other conflicts, and all we're sitting here with is that hammer.
And finally, to wrap up the conversation, Barbara, if someone in Bucks County wanted to get involved in peace work, where do you suggest they turn to?
I would suggest there's the coalition, Princeton Coalition for Peace Action. There's the Peace Center. Most community, I know there's a national peace action as well. But I would be looking at some of the Quaker organizations. Usually Quaker organizations and even places of faith will have a peace and social justice committee. Get involved with whoever is closest to you. Take the time to read about Hiroshima and Nagasaki just for your own historical memory. These stories need to be read about, heard about, told, so that we are in a place where we can be part of that memory for the younger generation, saying, this is why we're doing this program, so that you can know what happened and what we need to prevent, because we need to be supplying the next group of peacemakers, youth with peacemaking tools.
And we'll leave a list of books and resources for listeners in the show notes as well. Barbara, thank you so much for coming on the program today, and thank you for your decades of peace work that you've been and continue to undertake.
Well, thanks so much for that recognition, Cyril, and thanks for your good work too. Take care.
Thank you, Barbara. This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril McAlego, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.
The Signal is produced by Kevin Mahoney at Raging Chicken Media. Intro-outro music by Maf et Tula, featuring Cartas a Felice, used with permission.